Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this month's webinar. And this month we're going to take something a little bit different. For those of you who might know or might not know, the gentleman who co-wrote The Millionaire Next Door died in March from a car accident. So what I thought I'd do this month is take a look at what some of the findings were with their book and who truly is the millionaire next door. The big thing when you look at the millionaire next door, the author who passed away was Dr. Thomas Stanley. The co-author was William Danko. But what these gentlemen found essentially is people either can look like a millionaire or act like a millionaire. And what I mean by that, and I say this all the time to people and clients, you can either, looking like a millionaire, you drive the Mercedes Benz, you've got a huge, 6,000 square foot house, you've got a pool out back, you're taking, first class tickets to Hawaii and staying in the nicest resorts, everything that you kind of associate with millionaires. Well, the reality is the vast majority of the true millionaires in our country are completely opposite of that. And what's really a funny story, I always remember hearing these guys talk about it. Essentially what they did is they interviewed, I think it was 10,000 people who were millionaires. And before they started the whole process, they had a reception for these folks. So, they figured these folks are millionaires. They're going to want the finest of everything. So they reserved, a whole floor on the Hilton, the big conference room there. They had it stacked with champagne and caviar and all the things you think that millionaires would enjoy for food and beverage. Well, the first gentleman who walks in kind of comes in with overalls and a flannel shirt, and the folks running the reception thought, well, this guy's obviously just happened into this reception area. He doesn't belong here. They ran up to him and they're going to try to get him out of there before the wealthy millionaires show up and see this guy. Well, it turns out that this guy's on their list. So they check him in and he starts looking over the food. And after a couple minutes, he comes up to the, Stanley and Danko and says, hey, can somebody just go get me a beer? And what they found is all the people that kept coming into this reception were just like the first gentleman. They didn't have the expensive taste. They were very common folks. And it's funny, the original title for The Millionaire Next Door was actually called Big Hat, No Cattle. And it kind of goes with one of the people that they interviewed. It's a saying, if you're from Texas, you probably know this pretty well. People with the big hats, expensive hats, but they don't have any cattle, nothing behind it. And the reality is, the people who build true wealth may not have a big hat, but they've got lots of cattle. And the book, for a finance book, it sold over 3 million copies. And oddly enough, it turned the two authors into Millionaire Next Door. Dr. Stanley, who passed away, was in research in the college profession. And after that, he basically got out of being a professor and was able to just focus on his writing. So both of those guys ended up becoming the Millionaire Next Door from their book. But it's very rare for a finance book to sell that many copies. And it's kind of become the Bible for many people. A lot of people, and I've done this before, is you give it to folks to try to help them figure out how they can get to this level of being a millionaire. So the biggest takeaways from the book, and that's really what I wanted to talk about here. Obviously, as you can imagine, people who aren't living high in the hog, they're living well below their means. And what they found when they surveyed the 10,000 millionaires is these folks are saving at least 15% of their income. And they were also living on basically 7% of their net worth. So what they were living on was their income minus their savings, which amounted to about 7% of their net worth. Most of the millionaires next door had 6.5 times the wealth of all their neighbors. So they lived in very common middle-class neighborhoods, but they were very wealthy relative to their neighbors. And the other big thing that goes along with living below your means, they all avoided buying status objects. They didn't have a Rolex. They didn't have a Mercedes. Didn't have any of that stuff. They avoided the status lifestyle. They didn't care what you think of them. They drove an old Ford pickup and they wore hand-me-down shirts or garage sale shirts. They didn't care. Another thing, big takeaway, is 2/3 of the people that they looked at were self-employed. Now that's pretty impressive when 2/3 of the millionaires were self-employed, but only 20% of the workforce are business owners. So that kind of shows you that owning your own business is certainly one of the quickest ways, or one of the best ways, to build wealth. And the other interesting thing is, a lot of times Dr. Stanley would talk about the bovine semen distributors. That was one of the people they profiled, and I'm not making a joke here. If you Google that, you'll see it. But what they found is it's really business owners in boring professions. You could kind of imagine being a bovine semen distributor is a very boring business, but also welders, pest control folks, mobile home park owners. These are some of the people that they found. Very boring businesses. Another key takeaway, and one of the points they really drive home frequently in the book, was you aren't what you drive. In fact, that was one of the chapters. You aren't what you drive. So most of the millionaires very rarely had new cars, almost never had foreign cars, no Mercedes, no BMWs, nothing that would cause you to spend $200 to get your oil changed. The other big thing is they never financed their cars. That may be a little bit different now with financing at below 1%, 2%. Maybe it does make sense to finance, but generally this was written back in the 90s when car loans were probably between 5 and 8%. So none of them financed it. Now, what's kind of unfortunate is the authors of this book, Danko and Stanley, didn't get this lesson. Danko talks about how he drove a Mercedes, and he was spending the $200 for each oil change. And so when he got his wealth through the book, he didn't listen to that, and he went out and bought a really nice car. And Dr. Stanley, when he passed the car accident, he was driving a Corvette. And as you can imagine, Corvettes, when you get in collisions with Corvettes with the fiberglass body, they're really not the most sturdy of vehicles. So maybe had he been driving a Ford pickup, maybe he'd still be alive today. I don't know. I don't know details on the accident, but it's pretty clear when you drive around in a Corvette, you weren't you weren't driving a car that was well below your means. Another interesting takeaway is how the wealthy focus on giving things to their children. What Dr. Stanley and Mr. Danko found out was those parents who didn't lavish their children with money, who didn't lavish them with gifts, their children end up building more wealth than those that were given things. Kind of a good lesson here. If you do build wealth, the worst thing you can do is start to give it to your children. You should not enable your children with any of their habits. You shouldn't help them out. You shouldn't co-sign for anything. It's okay to maybe make a one-time distribution. In fact, that's what they kind of found when some of these wealthy folks, when their kids would enter school, or if their kids were getting married, they would make a one-time gift, say, hey, this is a one-time gift, manage it wisely. And the children typically did. But those that kind of came to mom and dad for as a checkbook, those kids never built wealth on their own. In the book, Danko and Stanley kind of talk about the wealthy versus the non-wealthy. And they had actual phrases for this. They called the wealthy people prodigious accumulators of wealth, or PAWs, and under accumulators of wealth, or UAWs. And they had kind of a factor that you should look at for yourself to see if you're a PAW or UAW. So you take your age, multiply that by your pre-tax annual income, and divide by 10%. And if you hit that number, then you can say that you're a prodigious accumulator of wealth. If you're under that number, then you're a UAW, under accumulator of wealth. So, for example, let's say you take a 40-year-old, makes $100,000 a year. Well, plugging that in, 40 times 100,000, that gives you 4 million. You divide that by 10, so they should have a net worth of $400,000. So if you're under that 400K, yeah, you need to start working. If you're over it, hey, pat yourself on the back, but don't get too lazy. Keep plugging away. Keep working at it. And, and as they looked at things, they found that there were a lot of bad habits of the UAWs. One of the big things was smoking and alcohol use. And they found people who had frequent use of both of those that cost them millions of dollars over time. An example they used was, spending $30 a week for smoking. And if you take that over a 40-year period and had invested that just conservatively, you would have easily had over $1 million. So smoking, if you're a smoker out there, just realize that you are following bad habits of the UAWs. And if you can, not only quit smoking, help your health, it's also going to help your wallet. We've already mentioned cars, but that's obviously one of the things that the UAWs do. They have the latest model. They buy some foreign cars. That's a status symbol, and they finance them. Bad ideas. The other big thing that they found was the UAW spend very little time focusing on wealth building. Most UAWs would spend more time planning a vacation or researching a purchase of a car than they do on their investments or finances. So you can tell a little bit about where you're headed based on the amount of time you spend on your finances. So yeah, if you're searching 25 different sites to buy, something you can get on Amazon, then you're probably spending too much time on that, not enough time focused on your finances. The other interesting thing, they actually talked about sometimes people with the higher incomes were actually UAWs. Now, they may have wealth, but they don't have wealth equivalent to their income levels. And they frequently talked about how doctors were prime examples. Doctors typically see themselves as kind of a status symbol in society, and they feel that they're wealthier people, so that they should have the Mercedes. They should have the big house. They should have the country club membership. The reality is their true wealth compared to their income is quite low. They wouldn't pass that test where I'm talking about you take your age, time your income, divided by 10%. So that was kind of interesting. They found a direct correlation to the higher your income, the more you were probably going to be a UAW. Doesn't mean that they didn't, a doctor may have $1 million, but if a doctor's making $400,000 and that doctor's 50 years old, then they're clearly not saving wealth or building wealth the way they should. Some other interesting tidbits. What most people might assume is the fact that the people with English descent would have more wealth when you look at various ethnic groups. And the reason for that is when we started our country back in the 1600s, 1700s, the wealthiest people in our country were landowners. And most of the landowners were originally from British descent. They were the ones who owned the land in the U.S. So you would think that they might carry on, pass that wealth to their children and their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, but that's not the case. They found that that's just not happening. In fact, oddly enough, the wealthiest people are the Scottish. And you may have heard that how Scots are cheap. And I've got Scottish blood in me. My grandfather was I think probably 80% Scottish. And I know I inherited his cheapness. And just ask, if you don't believe me, just ask my wife. But what they're finding, the Scots, yeah, they're cheap, but they're wealthy. So in the United States, people of Scottish descent make up about 1.7% of the households. But they make up 9.3% of the millionaires. Interesting what Danko and Stanley found out is a Scot who earns about $100,000 a year saves more than the average American who's earning $125,000 a year. So yeah, if you're Scottish, you probably have a decent little net worth. Good for you. You probably drink some pretty dark beer as well. But anyway, the other thing that they found is even though a lot of the millionaires next door do a good job in not giving their children wealth, they might actually be hurting their children with the guidance that they provide. So a lot of these millionaires next door are business owners in very boring businesses, so that they might be sewage pump control companies or laundry mats, or real boring stuff. And most of these people worked really hard. They might be spending 55 to 70 hours a week working. So they want a better lifestyle for their children. So they push their children to go to college, get professional designations such as a lawyer, a doctor, a CPA. So they're telling their children to put off earning money to get this education. And what these Millionaire Next Door want is they want better lifestyles for the kids. They want kids to have a better house, to have better cars, all of that. But when you look at the building of wealth, that's the worst thing you can do. So it's kind of funny that the folks who have the wealth are actually guiding their children in the wrong direction, trying to get them to get designations, to get professions that will give them the bigger house, the bigger cars, rather than just basically imparting the same lessons that they had. Work hard, live below your means, be self-employed, save your money. That's what they should be giving to their children, but instead they're trying to give them a kind of a different lifestyle. And that's kind of natural. I mean, people who work really hard don't want their children to have to work as hard as they did. But they might be better off if they were giving the same lessons that they had. So anyway, I just thought it'd be kind of cool to take a look, sort of honor Dr. Stanley. It's horrible that he passed in a car accident, but he did have a big impact on many people, again, selling more than 3 million books. But again, the big things, the final thoughts: spend less than you make. No matter what you do, you don't have to be a business owner. If you have a regular 9-to-5 job, the key is to spend less than you make. Don't get into status symbols. And I always say, I can always tell people who have wealth and didn't have huge incomes because they practiced delayed gratification. If you can delay gratification, you can build wealth. So again, thank you for taking some time to listen and watch this webinar. If you'd like more information, please sign up for our newsletter. You'll get all of this every month. picketfencefinancial.com/education. You can also find some videos there, past webinars, past newsletters, all kinds of good stuff there. Or you could go to our Facebook page, sign up there. We post everything to Facebook and our YouTube. Also, if you have any questions or if you have any ideas for future webinars, I'd love to get your information, love to get your ideas. But we'll talk to you soon. Take care.